is Patrick Whitbold from UMass and the WINS group. We have a few of us here in the room, and many of us are joined in remotely. I know you can't talk back, but thank you for coming to this, and I'm sure there's other groups of people at tables similar. So we're going to have Steve Wilson from the WINS group present. You should be able to see the slides, a state survey to improve our understanding of drinking water technology approval. So in respect for time, I'm going to hand it over to Steve.
Thanks, Patrick. Well, I want to recognize everyone that's involved here. Bruce DeVork from Nebraska and Dave Reckhow. Daryl Osterhout and Jim Taff are both with ASDWA, and ASDWA is the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. They represent in Washington all of the state primacy leads, and it's a very active group. They do a lot of policy work, and they've actually tried to work on this issue for a number of years. And so it made sense when we wrote this proposal to include them and ask that they help us, because they basically have the state's ear. And also, Chad, it was instrumental in helping write the questions that we put together for the survey, and several other folks helped too. Bill Hogrew from RCAP was involved a little bit as well. So I'm just going to move forward here. Maybe. There we go. I put this up basically because I know we're recording this. I'm at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and you can see here the whole group of folks that are involved. This map, use it, put it in your memory for reference to the map I'm going to show in a little while of the Arsenic Demonstration Program, because I think you'll be surprised at how many states were involved in that and how many people don't actually know about that program. So what I'm talking about today, the state survey, what we put in our project proposal for project B1, which the B projects for us were those that are non-treatment, basically looking at other issues related to technology and acceptance of small systems. And so B1, the objectives were really to identify and catalog state approaches to technology acceptance. So look at barriers, procedures, all their legal requirements, whatever issues there might be related to state acceptance to new technologies from a slant of small systems. And then our plan is to use those results as a starting point for a work group of state agency folks who actually do the technology acceptance to try to come up with a streamlined plan, if you will, or a white paper that describes here are the data needs we believe everyone should be putting together if you're a vendor or a researcher or whatever, and some of the information that's needed, what barriers do we see between states, and how to get at facilitating better acceptance of technologies. With the goal, in the end, it comes down a lot to costs and ability to run the systems, and so how do we deal with those issues? And then as a third piece of this, Dave Reckhow is working with the New England states to eventually apply the results of what we find from the work group and look at possibly multi-state acceptance, either of a specific technology or just as an approach to try to get them talking more about maybe accepting technology together. I want to mention, I've got a few slides in here that came from Bill Hogrew, and they're based on work that DRISC is doing. Again, I'm with the WINS Center. And this is one piece. Bill spoke on this at ASDWA and also at the RCAP National Conference that we just attended. And they're interrelated. A lot of the work that we're doing is kind of the front end that's going to help inform the work that DRISC is trying to do, looking at developing this approach to determining, doing multivariate analysis and things to look at the best technologies to use that, as this says in the slide, to go beyond the comparison of costs. And I'll show two more slides later that kind of describe a little more about that. So to determine the approaches, so what we decided to do is we contacted ASDWA, as I mentioned, when we wrote the proposal. They're really the key to getting the states involved where they might not give us the time of day, as was their respected organization that leads them, so to speak, in Washington. And so we also shared our plan with DRISC, and as everyone that's involved here realizes we've really started running a lot of the components of both centers together, at least sharing what we can. And so we decided on an online survey. That's what ASDA wanted us to do. We beta tested a draft survey. And then in the end, we had 16 questions. We did it through SurveyMonkey, and ASDA sent it out in mid-June. So it covered, the basics of their program. How many staff do they have? How do they go about it? Do they have a standard acceptance policy? Or are they doing it technology by technology? Some of those things. What are their data needs and barriers? Every state does things a little differently. And, then what interest do they have moving forward in working with us? And again, to develop this work group and maybe come up with at least some material that would suggest to a vendor or a researcher, here's some of the data that we know the states are going to want if you're going to try to get a technology accepted there. So how often do you consider new technologies for small systems? And we couch that as under 3,300 people. Most said infrequently, rarely, or never, and that's the comments we received. It's too risky. We found some states actually expect the communities to pay for the piloting. In other states, the vendor pays for the piloting. And in general, they're discouraged for other reasons, not just cost and lack of data, but also because of the ability of an operator to actually run a system that might have an innovative technology. So about a standard approach, do you have something on the books, or do you have written rules or guidelines? 23 said yes, 15 said no. Some said they use the 10 state standards. There's some said they use just ANSI standards. And, these are some of the other comments we got. They do it on a case-by-case basis. They require piloting and operational testing. That varied from state to state. 18 did say they have written documentation, and we're still in the process of pulling all that together to get a look at that. How often do you have a sufficient technical background? Every state is different in their ability. We found, I manage wateroperator.org, and what we found is that there are some states that put state resources into capacity development for their small systems, and those states have asset management documentation or programs that folks can use. They develop materials that help operators train for their operator exams, all those sorts of things. Other states that don't put those resources in only have their set-aside money from SRF, and a lot of times they aren't developing those materials. So you really have haves and have-nots around the country, and that's really the same situation with technology acceptance. Some have a small staff and they have no funding, and so there's never or rarely do they have the expertise. Some put a lot of money into their state programs, and so they often do have the expertise and they have dedicated staff. So for new technologies, some of the other comments we received that they have to develop the expertise. If it's something they've never seen before, they can't just rely on the vendor or the limited research results that might show it works in these specific situations. And so they have to develop it every time, and it's time consuming, or if they're trying to research a certain technology, they just don't have the staff for that. And it's ironic because this bottom comment here, most challenging technology by far was UV. And I'll get to that in a minute, but UV is fairly well accepted around the country these days, and so it's not as emerging as some of the other things, but it's a challenge because of regs. And the bottom line is, for most regulations, the Safe Drinking Water Act, or EPA, has specific rules on how they're used, when they're applied, all that sort of thing. But for UV, they just provided guidance, and that gives states fits. I know at the Small Systems Workshop, I talked to one state agency that said their state legislature and their governor will not allow them to provide any advice or documentation or develop any sort of rules for anything that's not specifically a rule from US EPA. So in the case of UV, they can't give guidance to their own systems because that's what their state has told them they have to do. So there's different challenges in different places. So as far as barriers to acceptance, we provided a list and then we asked for other. And so really at staff time, and amount of staff to run a program, as well as lack of performance data, and so that they can properly evaluate things, so that they can train their staff to evaluate things, and just having enough money and time. And so those are the big ones. There were 40 respondents to the survey. Everyone could have marked each one of these, and this is how it fell out. And so it kind of gives you an idea of where they stand. Some are fighting their own regulations or statutes. And so, again, I mentioned earlier, the cost to vendors to meet program requirements. In some states, the vendor is expected to pay for the pilot. And in other states, the community is expected to pay for the pilot. So I imagine if I'm a vendor, I know which states I'm trying to pilot my material in. So yeah, it certainly creates a disparity around the country on who is able to do what. Some other barriers that were mentioned, concern over higher pay and education. Some of these technologies require a lot more maintenance and understanding, when you might need to change out media, some of those things. And so they're worried about a lot of the small system operators in particular having the expertise and the ability and technical knowledge to handle those things. Again, the cost to obtain performance data is it's very expensive. And even for the ETV program, which I'll mention in a minute, a lot of states say that the ETV program didn't go far enough as far as timing, so that the piloting was done long enough that it really showed differences in water quality throughout the year and some of those things. So trying to get past some of these barriers is a pretty monumental thing, as the bottom line. So what specific type of questions need to be answered? This gets at the data. It's not just performance data for how much is being removed of a certain constituent, but it's also different water qualities, looking at what residuals are produced. You can see here, they're looking for third-party certification where it's appropriate so that they have an independent way to verify, and that's a lot of states that don't have the ability themselves. And so they want to know that it's what it's going to cost, what it's going to cost to operate, and all these issues that are pretty common from state to state. Some other things that were mentioned, making the pilot data available, also making the technology information available. A lot of times vendors will only provide the state performance data, not a lot of information on how the technology may work or what actually the processes are that are actually doing the work, doing the heavy lifting related to the technology, because they say it's proprietary. And I know this came up at our small systems workshop in August. And, I mentioned at that meeting, vendors have to get over that. That's too bad. If they want to, they can ask the state to sign a disclosure agreement, some of those kind of issues. But the state has to be able to ensure that they're protecting public health. And that's the angle they're coming from. So it's not about funding. It's not about money. It's about, we have to be sure as a state that what we're allowing you to do is going to protect public health. And if they don't have that assurance or a fair amount of certainty that it's that what they're doing is doing that, they're not going to approve a technology. So some other deficiencies that folks have ran into, again, piloting in one place or piloting in a lab obviously doesn't give you the range of water qualities. A lot of issues related to scale. It's not full scale, or the length of time. I mentioned that earlier. And just knowing what to ask up front. And I thought that was a very intuitive response. You have a new technology, you come into a state, you can't expect the state to know all of the questions they're going to need to ask until they've seen it ran, and until they understand how it works, and until someone's been trained and they've had some time to operate things to see what issues there might be. It's like any other anything else that you build, any other kind of device. Until you work with it and understand it, you don't have an idea of what issues you might have. So there's a lot to overcome here is the bottom line, I guess. So which technologies listed below? We provided 14, these that are listed here. Have you evaluated or approved for use? So we gave them, they can answer 1 through 5. They've never seen it, or it's never been requested and they're unfamiliar with it, all the way to its commonly applied, which means more than 5 systems in their state. You can see here, UV, LED, it's only been, the numbers, the big numbers here, the 16, 5, 18, 24, means they answered at least 3, 4, or 5, and the small numbers are that are next to the words, that's how many that have been, were a 5, I believe. And so you could see that some are commonly applied and some still aren't being used that often. And that actually gives all of you some information that you can use. For instance, I'm going to show a slide in a minute on some of these technologies. So Dave, for instance, Dave Reckhow is working with ferrite oxidation. Which states can he go to find out how it's working, what kind of water qualities, where communities might it be used in. This survey is going to allow us to understand that a little better, who the contacts are, which states we might want to contact and work with if we're working on a particular technology. And so, for instance, for ferrite oxidation, these are the states that listed that at least one plant, they've allowed it. And so these are the states that Dave may want to consider working with, for instance, as an example. But we have, a full range of, we had one respondent here we have no contact information for. We can probably figure it out because we know the IP address, but so far we've kept that anonymous. They obviously wanted to stay that way. And so it goes from, ferrite is minimally used around the country, but it has been approved in some places. And Nevada and Idaho are using it a lot, it appears. So things like UV, medium pressure, and low pressure UV are pretty well accepted. They're used in a lot of places, but LED UV, which is a brand new technology, this is what we got back. And so only one state's really using it, and that's North Carolina. But if you're involved in research looking at UV with LED, and you didn't know that North Carolina was involved with this, now you might have someone to contact and some resources to follow up with in order to find out a little more about what's been going on and where it's been accepted. And that helps us all. Point of use, I threw this in because those of you that have been involved with this issue, especially after the arsenic rule changed in 2006, there's a lot that went up in arms about point of use technology and accepting it for community water systems. In most cases, these are very, very small systems. The operator has to go in and change the cartridges if it's that sort of system that requires that, and do the maintenance, make sure it's working right. They have to take samples from the home. And so there were a lot of issues when this all happened, and I was involved with a little bit of this. So I thought it's interesting, so many states in the end have agreed to use point of use as an option as a treatment technology for community and non-community systems. And so that brings up another good point. One question we did not ask in the survey is if they're talking about community only or any public water supply, which means it could be a non-community system. And I'm sure some of these states only allow it for non-communities. And that's something we didn't ask, and we really should have. It's something we'll probably try to get out of most of the folks that are involved here as we move down the road. So to sum up what we found from the survey anyway, the issues we have, and again, looking at this from the small system lens, there's not a lot of consideration for small systems around the country just because it's so costly and it's too much of a risk for them, especially if they're footing the bill for the piloting for a new technology. UV, as I mentioned before, it's really widely used, but it's also the most challenging for states because the EPA hasn't given them clear direction. It's a guidance document. It's not a rule that says you shall use it this way. And in some states, that's really a problem for them. And so it's a case-by-case basis, and it's probably always going to be unless the rules change. So the most prevalent barriers were staff time and training and performance data, and obviously costs get into all of those issues. The cost to pilot and collect data and have enough staff to review. And also in a number of cases, and I think this last bullet, adequate data on residuals and waste generation, that came up because it wasn't really addressed as well as it maybe could have been in ETV, which is the Environmental Technology Verification Program. and the Arsenic Demo Program, although some of that was. I think the good news for all of us is that there are a number of systems in place for all these technologies. And so there might be data available that you didn't realize was available, that now we may at least have a starting point to find systems in use and talk to those operators or those state agencies to gather, what they've learned and what they know. So getting at that point, the vision for the centers, both centers, these aren't just weren't put together to develop new technologies. They're really looking at the small system issues, which means facilitating acceptance of both new and existing technologies in states so that it can help small systems, trying to improve the relationships so that the users and the developers, and that's what our survey is really about, is trying to get everybody at the table. And so, and fostering that dialogue among regulators. So doing so, if we can create a more uniform set of rules or guidelines or however you want to couch it, it will hopefully increase awareness, raise that vocal point, if you will, and allow more states to work together to try to accept technologies, which will drive down the costs and allow for more small systems possibly to get in the market for emerging technologies or new technologies. So I want to talk about ETV and the Arsenic Demo Program a little bit because they really sit at the heart of the issues that we're going to have as we move forward. So the Environmental Technology Verification Program was ran from 95 to 2014. EPA, I'll show the page in a minute, but it's was a attempt, if you will, to create a standard approach to technology verification. If a technology was ETV verified, that meant at least it went through some testing, meeting their protocols, and it provided with the states with some more assurance as another kind of a third party, if you will, of how good a technology or where it might be applicable in some of those things. So out of our respondents, only 19 used it or said they were part of their approval process. 8 weren't even aware of the program. And, some of these folks are new. They're younger. They may have only been working at their agency for a year or two. And so that's probably why ETV's been decommissioned, if you will. It's not available and it's not actively being updated. So what we found from the comments we got was basically that for a few things ETV was useful, but for many others it wasn't. Some used it for the membrane approval. And what is important to all of us is that it is still available. If you go, and I made this big enough and it's a little off center because I wanted to make sure to include all the information on all of these slides. You'll see I made sure the URL was visible and some other things. So this is on their archive page now, but if you scroll down this page, there's their case studies are available, the results of all their performance verification. Down at the bottom, some of the program highlights on some of the different technologies they've tested, and it's certainly something that everyone should look through and understand that's going to be involved in this sort of work. It gives you some insight on what kind of data they're looking for, and also where data were not available or where things weren't done as they should be. Also, I wanted to mention the Arsenic Demonstration Program. So when the arsenic rule changed, EPA agreed to or promulgated the rule in 2001. It took effect in 2006. It changed the arsenic standard from 50 to 10. It raised a lot of concern around the country about the value of doing that versus the cost. That's still being argued today. But 11 were not aware of the program, and 15 said they did use it. In some states, arsenic's not an issue, and most of the folks that did use the Arsenic Demo Program information thought it was very, very useful. And it's because they put a lot of money into conducting arsenic demonstration projects full scale at non-community and small community systems all around the country. And by doing so, they tracked everything: costs, amount of labor, you name it. And I'll show some of that information here. And the results of this information are all available. And it's really a model. I think talking to a number of states, something similar to the Arsenic Demo Program is what we all would like to see as far as the kind of data that's made available to help a state make a decision on whether to accept a technology. And so it's something to consider. So what we got from the survey, how did it influence acceptance? Very reliable data, had information, even on what oxidizers would work where and some of those things, co-precipitating with iron and all those issues. But it really allowed them to make informed decisions because there was a lot of performance data available. It highlighted where the limitations are, and there was no vendor influence. Now, there were vendors involved. It was their technologies, but it was ran by an independent consultant, and they were ran for a year. So it not only was it piloted full scale, but it was ran for a complete year free of charge to the facility, and that provided a lot of information even on, disposal issues and waste streams and those sorts of things. I think one of the most valuable things for the states when the small systems workshop that's in Cincinnati every August, they just had the 12th one at the end of August this year, the first 3 or 4 were all just about the Arsenic Demo Program. And I think it was in either year 2 or 3, they invited a panel of 12 of these systems, the operator. And I mean, these are either non-community systems or very small systems, under 100 gallons a minute type of systems. They invited them to come and talk about the issues they had. And one of the operators said, we had to turn off our system. We're not using it actually. They gave them a brand new system, hundreds of thousands of dollars. They couldn't afford to run it. And it was really helped some of the states that were there understand that there's a lot more to this than just being able to take out the constituent in their treatment train. So other benefits, we gave them a laundry list of benefits and asked them to check all that apply. So reliable pilot data was the biggest one, and also on performance and monitoring data after the fact. And so they also had consultants who were available. They held webinars, they did workshops, they helped them, the operators learn how to use the technology. And then the EPA came in and said, we're working with the states. Their state primacy agency still basically has to agree to do this. And so if it didn't work, they would guarantee they would replace it. So having all the cost data and funding data, and I'll show a little bit of that here in a minute, but I really encourage anyone who's developing new technologies to understand what's involved with the demo program, because it's really what the states would like to see down the road. This is where their first report was for I believe they had a second phase where they did 17 more. I think there's 67 total demonstration projects. But I took this from the report for the first 50, and you can see where they are. A lot of different areas where they have arsenic, and a lot of different types of situations. In Illinois, it was a sand and gravel, the one in the center of the state. Many of these are bedrock systems, so the water quality is different. But it allowed them to test these different technologies all over the country. So most of them were absorptive media. So here's the page that's still up and available. This is actually on the new EPA webpage. And if, for those of you that aren't aware, the EPA is in the middle of revamping their entire website. They've done this several times. And as someone who uses a lot of information from their website regularly, it's a real pain. Some pages you can't get to unless you already know the URL. Other pages just don't exist anymore. And, some of these are really hard to find. Even the EPA has told us that they're using some of their vendors to put information online while this is being done, just because otherwise their information won't be out for a long time. That's the bottom line. So there's an arsenic, the treatment program or the demonstration program has a page here. This is the top half, and it talks about what EPA funded, then what the utilities were responsible for, and the engineering firms they hired. And then down near the bottom of this page, it lists all the information and all the publications based on whether, it's an ion exchange system or absorptive media. And I highlighted the ETV publications that came out of this back in 2007. at the bottom here. But any one of these arrows open up to a much larger section of reports, like the arsenic demonstration final reports. There's at least 50 of those there on each individual system and how they worked. But they provided in their final summary report a lot of information about cost data and how things worked and O&M costs, and really valuable information that would help a state decide if a community can actually use a new technology. So I just highlighted here, this is a capital investment cost for larger systems. The 28 that used absorptive media, the larger systems are plotted here that use over 100 gallons a minute, and you can see they were able to come up with a regression line showing basically cost based on flow rate. Makes sense, and it looks nice. It's not perfect, but you have an idea if you're working with a system what it's going to cost if you're using one of these technologies, and so does a system and engineer who's developing it for them. But when you get down to the really small systems, the non-communities and the community systems that have flow rates under 100 GPM, you can see there's really no rhyme or reason. And that's part of our challenge is these in some ways almost have to be a case-by-case basis based on the chemistry, the situation. It doesn't follow what we hope to be a consistent design that we can, model even an approach based on flow rate anyway. So there's a lot of good information in these reports. For instance, another thing that I plotted here, the O&M costs for the absorptive media systems that have media replacement. The biggest, the most valuable piece is the far right side. I guess that's just labor costs. I thought there's a total. I might have cut something off here. But it tells you what it costs for all these different pieces of their O&M based on media replacement, chemical costs, electricity, labor, all that stuff. And it gives you a minimum, maximum, and an average. And so it gives you an idea of how each of these technologies might work in a given situation. This is really valuable data. And having all of this information out there certainly helps a state decide if this technology might be beneficial, as well as the engineer for a community if it's something they might want to consider. Quickly, all of this, I wanted to highlight the Arsenic Demo Program because I think it's something really useful for all of us that are developing, all of you, I should say, that are developing new technologies, and help you understand some of the considerations you need to make if you're really trying to bring this down to a small system and help a state understand what the all the logistics they need to know in order to implement a new type of technology. I want to mention that the DeRisk Center, and especially RCAP, and well, I guess this involves everyone, and involves Boulder too, but they're looking at some of this information. It's amazing how similar our projects were in some cases. And so part of what DeRisk is doing is developing both a relative risk index and a sustainability index, and then a methodology on how to evaluate using those indexes to determine, is a technology the best thing to use, this new technology? Is it appropriate? Should we use something else? And basically look at not just costs, not just operator knowledge and some of the things that are pretty evident, but also what other issues there might be, and kind of a multivariate approach to which technology should be used. And the way I look at it, the data we're collecting for our survey will really inform how DeRisk goes forward with some of this work. And I think that's already evident. But so for the methodology, which RCAP is doing, and Bill Hogru gave me these slides, they're looking at a multi-criteria decision support methodology that'll help people decide, does this support a small system considering this technology? And that's going to require a lot of data. The other reason I wanted to include this slide is DeRisk put in their proposal to create a data system for innovative treatment technology information. That's a big issue among all the states. And ETV was kind of the only game in town, if you will, for having some of that data available, and now that's gone away. And so this is one of the big issues that comes up among all the states, and even the technology providers and all the TA providers. There needs to be more information available and publicly available so that people can make more informed decisions. And so I know at the Small Systems Workshop, which I'll just go to that slide next, in August, we had a technology acceptance breakout group. It was a packed room, probably 60 or 70 people. And that issue came up, down here near the bottom, is the repository or data portal needed? Is an overwhelming yes. And so the situation becomes, we're trying to bring all of the folks that are involved with this kind of decision together, not just states, not just vendors, not just researchers, and decide where's the best place to put a portal like that, especially long term. And, what I mentioned at the workshop, the technology centers only are funded right now for 3 years. What happens to all that information after 3 years? We really need to consider looking at this as an industry and where we can put something like this that might be beneficial down the road. So without ATV, is there something needed to fill the gap? The universal agreement was yes. Matter of fact, Pennsylvania, their state director said she'd be willing to put some funds into getting this started if we were going to do that. And what we learned from everyone is, there was vendors in there were EPA folks. One of the EPA managers stood up and said, one thing I can tell you is that there will not be another ETV at EPA. So everyone's on their own. Don't consider, the states want EPA to take the lead. EPA made it clear that they will not be taking the lead in developing a new kind of data portal or repository of information. And so at least we know where we stand, and everyone can look at it from that, through those glasses, if you will. And so we need to develop, this is where we're at. We know what the states want. We know what the vendors want. We need everybody at the table. And, like it's come up several times, we're not going to solve this in the next year or two. The bottom line is this has been a problem that's been people have tried to deal with for the last 15, 20 years. And there's a reason why it hasn't been solved. And so we just need to do what we can to move this down the road and actually create a uniform direction that everybody can follow. So the last question we asked everybody, or one of the last questions was, as a state, would you have any interest in participating in one of these three, A, B, or C here? A is just an information sharing network. If you do a pilot or somebody does a pilot in your state, you share the information, any issues you've had, anything you know about a technology. And then the second one, moving down into more complexity, would you be willing to form a work group of states, neighboring states where, in theory, similar water, similar climate, some of those issues, similar geology, to develop a common set of standards for piloting, not agreeing to have the same rules or acceptance policies, but at least share data that way in some respect. And the third one was to partner with other state regulatory agencies to coordinate technology approval so that you could take advantage of commonalities and also reduce costs because of where it's appropriate. If you pilot in one state, it may be appropriate and acceptable in another. And so we asked those three questions, and from no interest to strong interest, and we basically got what you think you'd get. Only one person or only one state said they weren't interested in sharing data. I don't know what you say to that. More power to them. They must have everything figured out. But there's a lot of interest in sharing data and creating kind of this data portal, or at least something similar to the results of the Arsenic Demo Program, or ETV. As far as developing common standards, there's still a lot of interest. And really, I was surprised. Partnering, 34 answered here, and 23 said they would be interested, at least have some interest in trying to partner. And that's a recognition of lack of staff and the funding to actually bring in the newest technologies. We had a lot of comments here about different things. But some states said, we expect EPA to take the lead on this. And, it's just not going to happen. We had a state that said, we never approve a technology first. We wait till one of the states around us has approved a technology before we'll consider it. And that's flat out their policy. And so, we're learning a lot about how states can handle things, what they can and can't handle, and some of those issues. So I guess the last question was, would you be interested in being a part of our work group? And 24 said yes, 9 said no, and 7 just didn't respond. And so we've taken the 24 yeses, and we've sent them a lot of this data. And we actually have our first call next Friday. And we're going to outline information that we provided. Some of the data I showed today, like the ferrate and the UV, they've all been provided that information. And we've also had, at the ASDWA conference, we had a discussion with 2 of the vendor associations, WEMA and the Water Quality Association. And they're very interested in what's going on and feel that the states can't develop any kind of rules or protocols or approach on their own in a box, that everybody needs to be at the table. Our proposal that got funded to do this work through WINS doesn't include having vendors and everybody else. You can imagine what kind of effort that might be. But what we talked about doing is possibly having a separate set of meetings and trying to further things along that way. So where we're at is the first work group meeting is going to be next Friday on the 11th, and that's just for the states and those of us involved with this project. The goal is to develop a common set of data needs and try to look at what the barriers are to try to break those down and determine how we might approach some of those things, at least identify what they are so that everybody's aware and raise the level of knowledge on what states are facing regarding acceptance of new technologies. There are a number of different programs going on. So Confluence here is the, I guess, what are they called? I'm losing my train of thought. Confluence is basically the economic development group that's in Cincinnati, that works with Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky on technology development and trying to create startups and becoming kind of well, what's the right word? Boy, somebody help me out here. Anyway.
Yeah, they're just the technology clusters established by the EPA.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. I could not think of the word cluster.
For those things.
I couldn't think of cluster. So, and each cluster is different. They're all over the country. There's one in Milwaukee. There's one at CU Boulder. There's one in Boston. And so Confluence is the name of the one in Cincinnati. And they're the furthest along because ORD is there, the Office of Research and Development for EPA. And they actually have an ongoing program looking at UV and coming up with a common set of rules that all 3 states will agree to and abide by for piloting and acceptance of UV in those 3 states. And if that happens, that's the goal we're all looking for with this project, is to find a way to get groups of states to consider working together on accepting new technologies to help drive down costs and increase the amount of data that might be available and some of those things. And so this is where we're at. And as far as AWA has an innovation initiative looking at creating a data portal, there are efforts. There's a lot of international verification efforts ongoing. And so the idea is, how do we get all of these different groups all at one table, and so that we're all moving in a common direction and not having different groups going in different ways. And as far as going back to the WEMA and Water Quality Association, well, I guess it was Anita Anderson from the state of Minnesota and I met with them. And what we agreed to do is talk to the work group, which we'll do next week, and try to get a separate group that includes vendors, EPA, WEF, AWA, all the different players, and if nothing else, have them meet quarterly, and wherever we're at with the work group, we could share that information, and so that they could at least throw darts at where they're headed and say, here's some things you need to consider that we could then take back to the state's work group and try to create some communication among everyone. And so in a way, we're kind of getting in the middle of that, whether it's good or bad. I'm not sure. But that's all I have. And so if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Chad Seidel here, just from Boulder. Glad to have everybody available to listen on. We had to 22 people connected in here, and just looking at some of the groups that are involved, looks like we've got at least a good 40 to 50 people. So I think for those that might have questions or want to pose things, since I have had everybody muted, if you want to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself, or maybe identify yourself by chat, and we'll get it going that way. We've got about 10 minutes to ask some questions here. I think Steve gave a lot of great details about how to go with that. So I'll start. We have a hand being raised from Dr. Summers here in Boulder, so we'll send our little R2D2 camera over to him.
Steve, I just want to compliment you on what a great presentation and phenomenal survey. The fact that you got 40 of the states to participate at that level of questioning, to me, is very impressive. Just the fact that you got to everybody took a lot of work. I think it's very, very insightful, and I think it can have a big impact as we begin looking at the ways to move forward with this whole issue in the 3 years in the center and then beyond. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Scott. I would say that the next time you see Daryl Osterhout or Jim Taft from ASDWA, make sure and thank them. Because they're really, that's why we had 40 responses.
And I'll echo that same thing. The reality here is that these survey responses have articulated what I think both the DRISC and WIN centers proposals framed out, that while innovation of new technologies is an important attribute of solving the small systems issues in the U.S., we know that the technology alone is not going to solve the problem. There are other important barriers that need to be addressed, and the interactions between states, US EPA at the federal level, the technology providers, and bringing those new things to the market, and even just simply implementing the things that have been around a long time. Hearing from states that UV is still the most difficult thing for them to implement is a great litmus test of what is the real challenge. Other questions from folks? Feel free to unmute yourself and jump in.
Hey, this is John Tobias in at UMass. Also, thanks to Steve for a great presentation, and more importantly, the information from the survey is invaluable. Steve, I was curious what your thoughts are, or anybody else's, on the if not EPA, or given not EPA, then who, in terms of data portal database. We've tossed around over the last couple of years some ideas here at UMass, but is it AWWA? Is it what's the best idea that you've heard?
Well, you know, that came up at the ASDWA conference whenever I gave this talk, or part of this talk. People were like, you know, is this going to be ready? What's going to happen? Is the center going to have it? And, you know, I know DRISC has, even in their proposal, that they'll develop a data portal. But I think if we get all the players together, we just have to figure out who makes the most sense. I don't know that it's the vendors, because the states have made it clear that, you know, they don't always trust the vendors.
Yeah.
And so even the Vendors Association is probably a good choice. No. And so it may be AWWA, or, you know, it may be something that's not to, just thinking out loud myself, it may be a group that starts a separate organization where you've got a stakeholder from, you know, I think we need to get this committee together, not the state work group, but another committee that includes WEMA and water quality and EPA and WEF and AWA, and have those discussions. And, you know, if we're really going to do it, we should do it the right way the first time, and not have 4 different groups trying to develop data portals.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I have an answer, but like what I said at the ASDWA conference, when somebody said, you know, when's this going to be ready? You know, there's no illusion that this is going to be done in a few years. It's going to take a lot of time because there's so many issues, and that's why it hasn't been solved. But if we can get everybody at the table and come up with a clear direction that everybody agrees to, we've moved the ball way forward from where it's been.
Yeah. one other comment on a very specific thing is I just was engaging in a conversation with a water utility in Connecticut, one that I will be working for, doing something right now, but on their list of things related to, and this is a utility that owns lots of small systems, was working with the state regarding verification use of UV systems. So right there, that issue was on their list.
Absolutely, especially in Connecticut, where they've told us explicitly that they don't have the staff resource to review UV submitted approaches. I've been asking people if they could do that.
Oh, Chad, we didn't hear that. We couldn't hear most of what you just said.
Yeah, so I'll actually, maybe you can read my lips at the same time. All audio is changing. The state of Connecticut actually followed up with Steve and myself and Carl as WINS and D-Risk representatives at the ASDWA meeting in Fort Worth 2 months ago, specifically because they said they do not have the technical resource to review UV submitted materials in their state. And so they were at a loss of how to proceed with that, and we're looking for opportunities to move that ahead. And so I think Carl connected Jim Malley into the loop as well, and you certainly are advisable in that as well. So if there's anything we can do, I mean, frankly, if either of our centers can help move that ahead for the states that are just kind of a impediment to implementing those approaches where they're appropriate, and we can overcome those are really legitimate successes in my opinion. So
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, we've got just a couple of minutes here. I didn't want to miss, there was a question that came in from Saipan at McMaster University. You pose a great question. You say, I guess the residual free chlorine in the distribution systems won't be phased out in the near future. As an example, 30 years is my guess close to the fact. I will tell you, in the United States, chlorine residual will not be phased out in the distribution system. That is not an approach that folks in the U.S. are going to be willing to accept, although there are just a handful of groundwater supplied systems still remaining in the U.S. that have never applied disinfection. And some of those are hopeful to just be non-disinfected. However,
just won't be left alone.
I think it's more than a handful, but
yeah.
Well, on a percentage basis and population served, it's pretty low.
Yeah.
But
Certainly for population served.
Systems, absolutely. There are hundreds of small systems that still don't disinfect, but very, very small in terms of proportion. But
yeah.
Well, since we have to move out of our space here, I really appreciate everybody joining us today. We'll get the details out for the next one to be scheduled with our friends and colleagues from Brazeau WaterNet in Canada. Looking forward to that after the beginning of the year. So everybody enjoy safe and happy holidays, and we'll reconnect here shortly.
Ho, ho, ho.
All right. Take care.
Hey, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Colorado.
Thanks, Chad.
Bye-bye.
Hey, Chad.
So all we have to do is.
Yes.
Do I need to mail you the slides?
It would be terrific if you could. Yeah.
All right. I'll mail them to Patrick and to you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Take care, all.
Thank you.